Archiving started.
Welcome to our discussion of classical utilitarianism. Now, we will also call classical utilitarianism Act Utilitarianism throughout the remainder of the semester as well. In this lecture, we're going to get an introduction to one of the earlier forms of Act Utilitarianism, primarily designed by Englishman Jeremy Bentham. We're going to discuss a little bit about some of the general characteristics, that is, of utilitarianism. And we'll kind of end with our first decision-making procedures associated with Act Utilitarianism. Before we get deeper into this, I'd like for you to go and look at this video that features Peter Singer, a contemporary utilitarian, talking to Dan Rather on 60 Minutes. This particular piece is rather provocative, given Singer's description of Western living, in which he basically criticizes us for not living up to our reported words with regards to charity and so forth. It's a rather fascinating interview from a highly controversial philosopher who's remarkably active today. Some of our articles that we'll be reading this semester as well are from Peter Singer. So let's start talking about some of the general characteristics of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a value-based moral theory. That means that the principle of the good, or the theory of the good, is going to be more dominant or more important than the theory of the right. In fact, the theory of the right is going to be intensely related and intricately related to the theory of the good. Speaking of the good, utilitarianism is going to promote a maximization of that good. Now, maximization of a good is going to be an interesting concept that we're going to find is going to be fairly appealing to us, though perhaps some of the ways that utilitarianism gets there are not going to be so appealing. Another appealing characteristic of utilitarianism is that the welfare of all sentient creatures is to be considered. Now, we'll talk about this a little further whenever we discuss the decision-making procedure. But utilitarianism, unlike the theories that we've studied thus far, focuses on how all sentient creatures may be affected by our actions. Notice that this expands the sense of moral agency compared to other theories. Natural law theory promoted primarily humans and things with human nature, which are therefore only human. Divine command theory appears to only relate to beings who happen to have some type of agency, presumably instilled from them from a divine agent. Utilitarianism is going to be a much wider scope. Speaking of scope, utilitarianism is also universalist. Now, this is different than saying that it's a universal theory, though we're going to see that it does meet some of the characteristics of universality that we saw within our lecture on moral relativism. But in universalist theory, everyone counts. Again, the welfare of all sentient creatures is going to be considered whenever we go through our utilitarian decision-making procedure. Furthermore, the theory is impartialist as well. Everyone counts equally. Now, we're going to hear how this ends up becoming actually potentially devastating criticism of the theory. Likewise, it also is actually one of the aspects of the theory that is most appealing. Now, if we're going to discuss utilitarianism, we need to first get an idea of what utility is. Utility is basically the net value of the consequences of an action. If I commit some type of action, let's say that I'm going to choose to eat a piece of pie. There's going to be benefits and negative consequences to me eating the piece of pie. For example, perhaps I'm helping out a local business, or maybe I'm helping a friend feel good about their baking. I simply could enjoy the taste of it and find that it's filling or satiating my hunger. But there also could be negative consequences of the action as well. Digestion of maybe unnecessary calories. The possibility that now I have less available resources to me because I spent some of that on this piece of pie, and so forth. Utility basically means that I'm going to weigh my pros and my cons. And whenever I weigh my pros and my cons, I'm going to use that decision that I make, that final decision, to tell me whether or not the action is permissible or obligatory. That is, if the action likely outweighs, as to the good consequences outweigh the bad consequences, the action is likely permissible or obligatory. We'll get a little deeper into how we determine that in a little bit. Now, this concept of utility is also pretty interesting because it gives us a theory of the good which is in essence an empty category. It's almost as though it's a cup by which we're going to fill it with some value. Now, we're going to see that, in particular with Act Utilitarianism, happiness or pleasure is going to be the value that we measure within our utilitarian mathematics. Looking at the structure of our theory of the right is going to ultimately discuss how we should act in order to maximize utility. And ultimately, to bring about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, or sentient creatures. Our theory of utility is our idea of utility is our theory of the good. Again, this is going to ultimately be an empty category that we're going to fill in with our intrinsic value. That's going to act as our non-moral value. Again, for Act Utilitarianism, primarily this is going to be considered happiness or pleasure. But we may find that there are other forms of utilitarianism that may utilize other ideas of intrinsic good. The moral value of an agent, that is, whether or not the agent is praiseworthy or blameworthy for his or her actions, is determined whether or not that agent was acting to maximize utility, acting to bring about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of sentient creatures. Now, our theory in a nutshell is going to involve an idea we call the generic principle of utility. This gives us our theory of the right. An action is right if and only if it has a higher utility than any other alternative action that the agent can perform instead. So notice here that there's some interesting things going on. First, we've got an idea of what our decision-making procedure may look like. Mathematics, in essence, some calculations. We're going to have to try to figure out what the utility of our action may be. And then we're going to have to at least compare that to at least one other action, if not perhaps a wide range of actions. And the action that has the highest utility is the one that is morally obligatory for us. Our theory of the good is simply going to be the value whose utility is considered within the utilitarian calculus. Again, for the purposes of Act Utilitarianism, we're going to see that this is going to be happiness or pleasure. But again, other forms of utilitarianism and consequentialism in general may utilize other values. In hedonistic utilitarianism, which is going to be one of our earlier forms of utilitarianism, the consideration of welfare is identical with happiness, which is identical with pleasure. Pleasure alone is intrinsically good, whereas pain is intrinsically bad. Everything else will have extrinsic value based on the amount of pleasure that the action or thing may bring about, or the amount of pain that the action or thing may bring about. Notice here that this is a very interesting and very narrow conception of human welfare. Later in the semester, we'll discuss another conception of human welfare that may be a little more broad-minded. But for the utilitarian, welfare is pleasure. We are doing well in life if our life is pleasurable. Now, utilizing this brings us to our principle of hedonistic utility. That is, the utility is the overall balance of pain versus pleasure that would be produced by the considered action. If we plug that into our theory of the right, it tells us that an action is right if and only if it would produce at least as high an overall balance of pleasure versus pain as would any other alternative action. Again, this may seem mathematical, and there's a good reason. We're going to be doing a little bit of math. But before we jump to that point, I'd like for you to meet, so to speak, the founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham. There he is in all his glory. Jeremy Bentham was a rather prodigious Englishman in the late 18th century, early 19th century. He ended up bringing about actually many ideas which we still find remarkably used in our society today, including utilitarianism. For example, the idea of the panopticon, that is the idea of kind of how we build modern prisons, for example, comes from Jeremy Bentham. Now, Bentham was an intellectual giant in his time, and, well, his time has yet to really pass. After Bentham's death, he donated his body for a public anatomy lesson. His skeleton and his skull, interestingly enough, his head, were preserved, although not so well. And this box, which has his skeleton, as well as a wax head at this time, is on display at University College London. And at times, Mr. Bentham, even after his death, has held a present but not voting privilege at various council meetings, most notably on the 100th and 150th anniversaries of the college. Now, his head, unfortunately, was not preserved particularly well. It's now removed from the auto icon, and primarily due to repeated student pranks. One can only imagine the things that one could do with that head. Now, Bentham provides us with our first conception of a moral calculus as well. Bentham believes that there are 7 features that we should consider when we discuss what he calls his philosophic calculus, basically his happiness calculus. These are things that we need to consider whenever we're trying to weigh alternatives. Intensity and duration are pretty related. The intensity of a pleasure must be considered in terms of whether or not it's a more intense pleasure or a less intense pleasure. Clearly, a more intense pleasure is going to weigh heavier towards reasons to do one action versus another than a lower degree in pleasure. So, for example, perhaps the pleasure that I get from reading a good book and learning something may be a higher pleasure than, say, for example, eating that piece of pie. Duration is very similar as well. We have to consider how long the pleasure is considered to last. Again, should, for example, attending a concert and deriving the pleasure that may be associated with that, we may want to ask, is that better than, say, the pleasure we derive from sex? Depending on the situation, it may be. We also have to look at the question of certainty and uncertainty. How certain is it that pleasure is likely to come from the action? And how certain is it that pain could come from the action? Basically, we need to understand a little bit further about how likely it is that the consequence that we're desiring is going to be the consequence of the action. We also have to look at the question of extent. To whom, to what bodies, to which sentient agents or beings is our action going to affect? We also then look at the question of fecundity. That is, how likely is it that the pleasure is likely to beget additional pleasure, or that the pain is likely to beget additional pain? Purity must be considered as we consider whether or not the action is an action of pure pleasure or if it is mixed with pain. Clearly, presumably, an action that has 51 units of pleasure and 49 units of pain, whatever that may be, would be maybe not as good as an action that may provide 99 units of pleasure versus 1 unit of pain. Additionally, we have to look at the question of propinquity and remoteness. Basically, how close is the pleasure to us versus how far away? Now, an interesting scenario to look at and to apply this is to imagine this situation. Imagine that we live in a village with 100 people. A demon appears to us and tells us that he can bestow upon us all the pleasures of the world. In turn, however, we must, via some method, choose to allow him to eternally torture one of us. What do you think the utilitarian says we must do? That's an interesting question. It appears initially, at least on a prima facie analysis, that we should do this. After all, 99 people receiving all the pleasures of the world versus one person in pain seems like it could be worthwhile. But remember, we need to also ask the question about fecundity and the question of duration. It seems that on further analysis, that when that one person who is eternally tortured outlives the 99th person, so let's say they get to that, what would be a 100th lifetime, at that point, things begin possibly against taking up the demon's offer. And then let us imagine that the person has now survived the first 99 lifetimes. They've gone through another 99 lifetimes. So let's assume that we're at perhaps some zero sum at that point. But then we step over the line once we hit that 100th lifetime. So it appears that the decision we make may not be ethical if we choose to take up that goal.